Hey guys, it's Bella. Welcome back to my channel. I hope you guys are all having a wonderful day today. In today's video, we are going to be covering another Mystery Monday case, except today we're going to be talking about a solved case, not a mystery, which I feel like I've been doing like mostly solved cases recently. I haven't really done a good mystery, a good unsolved case in a while, and generally the videos that I do on my channel are cases that I want to talk about, I want to have a conversation about, I want to hear your opinions on, or just cases that I think need to be spoken about a bit more. But I feel like subliminally I have been gravitating towards solved cases because I feel like, you know, you guys prefer solved cases, but I do love a good unsolved mystery. I love talking about theories. I love hearing other people's theories. I love forming my own opinions on theories, but especially I love that there are always comments that are theories or just things that I have never thought about in relation to the case. Like that is always, I swear there's always something in the comments that like blows my mind and I'm like, I did not even think of that until right this very moment. And it makes so much sense. So definitely let me know if you guys just prefer solved cases in general or if you want to see some unsolved cases, some mysteries. And in saying that, always, if you have a case that you want to see or a recommendation or something you want to talk about, then leave it in the comments below because I love seeing your recommendations. I always read all of my comments. So I'd love to know your thoughts on what you want to see videos on and any cases that you find interesting. Anyway, today's case is a solved case. We're going to be talking about the Clydach Murders, and this case took place in South Wales in the UK. And this case actually resulted in the biggest murder investigation in Welsh history. Like this happened like I think 24 years ago, and still to this day, it is the biggest murder investigation that took place in Wales. And there actually has been some new information that's been surfacing about the case recently, even though it is solved. So we're going to talk about all of that today. But before we do, I just want to thank today's sponsor, Casetify, for making this video possible. I mean, I truly don't think Casetify needs an introduction here on my channel because they are my tried and true. I have been using Casetify cases for years. I cannot even remember the last time I used anything but Casetify on my phone. They just have the cutest cases. I've got a couple on rotation at the moment, honestly. I love to switch them up. I don't know, sometimes switching out phone cases makes it feel like I have a whole new phone. It just feels fresh, you know? But honestly, they have so many different cases. No matter who you are, what your vibe is, I guarantee there is a phone case on their website that you will love, and you can customize them too, which also makes for a really cute present. Plus, they are actual lifesavers. My phone would be in bits and pieces now if it wasn't for my Casetify cases. For their iPhone 14 series, they've actually just trademarked a new twister design, which has their EcoShock technology in it, which has 20% increased protection. So the protection is 6 times the military standard, and it also has drop cushioning. So your phone is like basically in a little cocoon of protection, but it doesn't look like it's in a cocoon. Like it's still really nice and slim and cute, which is what you want in a phone case. And they are also made of up to 65% recycled and plant-based materials, and some of those recycled materials are actually recycled phone cases from their Recasetify program. So if you guys do need a new case or you just want to check out, you just want to refresh up for your phone, you can go to casetify.com/Bella to get 15% off your order. And if you go to that link, then the discount will be automatically applied at checkout. So make sure you check that out. I will leave all of the information and the link in my description down below. And let's go ahead and get into today's video. So like I said, today we're going to be talking about the Clydach Murders, which took place in 1999 in a small village called Clydach, hence the name of the case. And Clydach was in South Wales in a place called the Swansea Valley. So let me start by introducing you to a woman named Mandy Power. She was 34 years old at the time that this case took place, and she had recently divorced from her husband, a man named Michael Power. The two of them had gotten married in 1986 and had 2 children together, but eventually the marriage did break down and they got divorced, but they did remain on good terms. Their children, Katie, who in 1999 was 10, and Emily, who was 8, moved in with Mandy into a house on Kelvin Road in 1998, and they moved into 9 Kelvin Road, and they also lived there with Mandy's mother. Doris. She was 80 years old and she was bedridden. Mandy was also described as being a bubbly, outgoing woman who was the life of the party, and she would always make time for her friends and her family. And on Saturday, the 26th of June in 1999, she was making time for her cousin. She went out and she babysat for her cousin, and then her and her children returned home just before midnight. But within 4 hours of her returning home, firefighters were called to the house because there had been a severe fire. Like, some of the house had been really severely burned, and inside the house the firefighters found the bodies of Mandy, Katie, Emily, and Doris. They actually had not perished in the fire. It was found that they had been severely beaten by an intruder. Doris had been killed in her bed, while Mandy, Emily, and Katie had all been killed in the landing of the home. Obviously, the police were called and they arrived at the house at 4:52 a.m. to start their investigation, and they started a task force of 50 South Wales police officers, which was led by Detective Superintendent Martin Lloyd Evans. Now, from the start of this investigation, it was pretty clear that this was not your typical house fire. Like, this fire had been deliberately lit and likely done so to try and conceal the fact that murders took place. I think probably the killer was thinking that if they burnt the house down, it would kind of look like the victims burned to death and perished in the fire rather than having been beaten to death beforehand. But that wasn't the case. Like, it was pretty clear that they had been beaten and then a fire had been lit to try and cover it up. There was also no signs of forced entry into the house, so it seemed like whoever the killer was, they probably knew the family and were able to gain access that way. There were also 3 key pieces of evidence that were found when they were investigating the house, the first of which was a blood-soaked sock, and it was theorized that this was kind of used like a glove. There was also a gold chain which was caked in blood, and it was theorized that this had actually been pulled off the attacker during a struggle. And then the third and probably the most important piece, to be honest, is the murder weapon. So the murder weapon was determined to be a 4-foot fiberglass rod, and it was determined that Mandy was actually struck by this 38 times, which is significantly more than any of the other victims were struck. So police were definitely at this point going off the assumption that the attacker was mainly there for Mandy. Like, this was a targeted attack on Mandy. And then I guess the other victims were kind of collateral because they were in the house at the time. And this theory was also strengthened by the fact that Mandy had been stripped naked after her death, and the killer had inserted a vibrator into her before trying to burn the house down to conceal the evidence. Investigators were actually under the impression that this isn't even something the killer intended to do. Like, they didn't intend to come and murder Mandy, because the fiberglass rod was actually from Mandy's home. It was just something that was like lying around in the house, and then the stuff that they used to try and burn down the house was also just from Mandy's house. Like, it also belonged to Mandy. So this killer came to the house. They were granted access, obviously, because there were no signs of forced entry, and they didn't come with any murder weapon. They didn't come with any sort of materials to burn the house down. It was all just stuff that they found in the house that facilitated this crime. And it was also determined that the fire, or the house, was set on fire on 2 separate occasions, the first time being at between 12:30 and 1 a.m. So by the time firefighters got there, the family could have already been dead for well over 3 hours. Obviously, police went and questioned neighbors and people in the area and just looked for any witnesses, anyone who may have heard something or seen something that just didn't look quite right. And the family's neighbor, a woman named Rosemary Jones, said that she did hear a car pull up at about 1 a.m. and so she believed that that might have been the killer. As police continued their inquiries and continued looking for witnesses and going house to house, they discovered that Mandy was actually having an affair. Obviously, she was divorced, but she was having an affair with a former police officer named Allison Lewis, who was married. So Allison was married to a current police officer who was still in the police force, like still active, and his name was Stephen Lewis. So obviously, you know, there is some motive there because Stephen's wife is sleeping with Mandy, and also he's a police officer. Like, it's not good. And it's also such a huge case. Like, Clydach is a small village. In 1999, there was about 7,000 people there. Like, it is not big. So obviously this case was huge. Like, it really shook this village. Everybody was talking about it. Everybody was also like really concerned because 4 people had been murdered in their small little town in such a gruesome way. So obviously this was in all of the newspapers. It was making national headlines. And not just because of the murder either, but also because there was this whole added layer of the affair. And if there's one thing the media loves, it is a scorned lover. They go crazy for it. Now, obviously, this affair, it's a massive motive for murder, so that's where police are initially looking. They're suspicious of Alison and her husband Stephen because, I mean, I don't think I need to tell you guys why. I think it's pretty obvious why. But they want to keep looking into all, like, possibilities. They want to make sure that they're leaving no stone unturned. They want to make sure that they are really thoroughly investigating this case. And, you know, also it's probably because Stephen is a cop and they want to make sure that they're not accusing a cop if there is some other possibility. Now, anyway, because of this affair, that is where police are initially looking. That's where they're obviously suspicious. You know, affair, massive motive for murder right there. So they're looking at Alison and Stephen from the side of their eyes. They don't want to leave any stone unturned. They want to keep looking. They don't want to like tunnel vision on these 2 people, on these 2 suspects, right? So in an effort to, you know, give Alison and Stephen the benefit of the doubt, the police went and interviewed the entire Welsh rugby team, female rugby team, on the 1st of July because Alison was also a national level rugby player. So they went and interviewed all of them to try and get the full picture, see if this was really an affair type of situation, or maybe they were kind of somehow both responsible for the situation that they're in. I mean, no matter what anybody said though, like, the media had already latched onto this affair and Alison and Stephen were really copping it in the media. Like, they had been labeled as murderers. Alison in particular was like really copping it, even though there was no actual evidence to tie them to the murders. And at this point they both had alibis in each other. Like, Stephen was Alison's alibi and Alison was Stephen's alibi. They both claimed that they were home at the time of the murders, which I'm just gonna say it, like, it's not really that tight of an alibi considering they're both suspects. But at around this time, another guy that the police were kind of looking into was a guy named David Morris, and he was a divorced father of 3 in his mid-30s, and he lived in a place called Craig Kefin Park, which is only about a mile away from where Mandy lived, and he allegedly had some previous involvement with Mandy, and there were rumors that they shared a casual sexual relationship. Now, at the time of the murders, David was actually dating another woman named Mandy. Her name was Mandy Jules. So from this point forward, like, I don't want to make this confusing because both of their names are Mandy. I'm going to refer to his girlfriend Mandy Jewel as Mandy Jewel, and then Mandy Power I'm just going to refer to as Mandy.
Little side note, but Mandy and Mandy are actually best friends.
Anyway, police interviewed David on the 2nd of July and he said that he had no involvement with Mandy. He said he obviously wasn't involved in the murders and that on the night of the murders he had been drinking, he'd been at the pub, and he was just like watching the rugby. And he had an alibi as well because his girlfriend Mandy Jewel said that he had returned home before the murders took place. So he couldn't have committed the murders because he was at home with his girlfriend. And obviously now there are 3 suspects, like the 3 people police have kind of looked into and gotten the vibe that they might be involved, all have these alibis, and so they're kind of coming up a little bit dry. And so they decide to have a press conference or make an appeal for information on the 13th of July. So this is 2 weeks after the murders have taken place. And then another 2 weeks later, so on the 26th of July, they start putting posters up around the village and continue to appeal for more information. They were still continuing their own investigation. This was and still is the biggest murder investigation in the history of Wales. So, you know, they really were doing all that they could. And by this point, according to the police, there just wasn't a lot of evidence. So they were really appealing killing for more information on anyone who was not the police officers. And it was a big investigation, huge. So eventually a woman comes forward, her name is Nicola Williams, and she basically says that she saw somebody hanging around Mandy's house on the morning of the murders at around 2:35 a.m. And she saw this person from a moving vehicle. So it wasn't really like a whole lot to go off, to be honest. Like, she could really only recall a rough height, a skin color, the fact that he was wearing a jacket, and he was carrying some sort of bag under his arm. But from her brief viewing of this guy from a moving car, from her brief description, they were able to come up with an e-fit of this guy. And an e-fit is an electronic facial identification technology. It's basically like a computer generated facial reconstruction. So they made an e-fit using Nicola's description, and it looked suspiciously like Stephen. And also it actually looked like someone else. It looked like a guy named Stuart, who happened to be Stephen's brother, who was also an active police officer. So police decided not to release this e-fit. I wonder why. Couldn't think of a single reason, to be honest with you. I mean, they later, when it came out that they decided not to release this, they obviously had to come up with a reason, and their reasoning was that they didn't think that this sighting aligned with the time of the crime, and they also think that the fact that he had a bag was maybe it wasn't the right guy, because if he used a murder weapon from the house and all of his fire burning materials were from inside the house, he obviously didn't show up with anything and he didn't leave with anything, so why would he need a bag? And that was their excuse to not release this e-fit. So after this, the case kind of goes cold. There's not a lot going on. There's not a lot of new evidence coming in. And so about 2.5 months later, so on the 13th of September, they decide to release a £30,000 reward for any information that would lead to an arrest. But unfortunately, this still didn't garner any leads. I really apologize as well for any construction noise. I wish there was a little switch I could flick, but unfortunately it is what it is. And we just have some lovely background ambiance today. In January of 2000, over 1,000 leaflets were handed out in Port Tennant, which is also in Swansea, and they were basically trying to get any information from anyone who knew anything about a heavily blood-stained man who was dropped off at a local newsagent in the area at around 5:35 a.m. on the morning of the murders. I couldn't really find any information about where this tip-off actually came from, but there was apparently some sort of report that came in saying they saw this man on Port Tennant Road at this time, and it was a bit suspicious, of course, because he was heavily bloodstained apparently. Unfortunately, I don't really think anything came of those leaflets because nothing really happened. There was no real information. And so another 6 months later, on the 21st of June, Mandy's relatives made a TV appeal asking for any new information. At this point, you really just want people to come forward with anything, no matter how insignificant it might be. You don't know how it's going to help with a case like this because it just seems like there really is nothing going on. There are no answers. Nothing is coming of this investigation at this time. And Mandy's relatives have lost 3 generations, Mandy's mother, Mandy, and her children, and Mandy's ex-husband as well has lost his children too, and his ex-wife, with no explanation. None of them know why any of this has happened, or who would do something like this to their family. At around the same time, they did actually release another e-fit, but it came out that this was unreliable. It was an e-fit of a woman, and the witnesses who provided this e-fit or helped create this e-fit were unreliable. So it was really just kind of a mess of a case at this point. There's no real evidence except for the chain and the bloody sock and the murder weapon that were all found at the house. And then it's crazy because they do have all of that evidence, but then there's just nothing else, They have no suspects, they have no new leads, nothing's happening. But the police were still investigating it. They were still actively trying to figure out what happened. So a few days after the family's appeal and the e-fit of the unreliable e-fit of that woman was released, the police decided to set up this mobile incident room on Kelvin Road, just hoping to uncover anything that they may have missed. any clues, witnesses, anything. It's been almost a year by this point, so I think they're really doing this and just hoping for a miracle. Now, at this time, what actually happened is one of Mandy's neighbors, her name was Louise Pugh, she was pretty close to Mandy as well, they were friends, not just neighbors, and she actually comes to police with some new information. The first thing she says is that the day leading up to Mandy's murder, that she had gone into town and she had bought 2 bottles of wine in anticipation of apparently seeing Allison later that night. So I don't know if she had plans to see Allison after she got back from babysitting for her cousin or what the deal was, but she was planning on seeing Allison, which is huge. And even huger is Louise said that apparently a couple of weeks before Mandy's murder, she had witnessed a man yelling at Mandy saying, "Stay away from my wife or I will kill you." And you know, if we want to take any guesses who we think that might have been, well, Louise did identify that man who yelled at Mandy as having been Stephen Lewis. So obviously, a couple of days later, on the 4th of July, Allison and Stephen Lewis were arrested on suspicion of the murders, and Stephen's brother Stuart, his twin brother, was also arrested on suspicion of attempting to pervert the course of justice. Allison denied having anything to do with the murders and denied that she had organized to go to Mandy's house the night that she was murdered. They all denied having any involvement and all kept to their original stories, saying that, you know, Allison and Stephen said that they had been home together, they had their alibis, like they were not breaking. Allison did admit to having an affair with Mandy, but she claimed that Stephen didn't even know about the affair, which, you know, seems pretty unlikely by this point. Now, you might be wondering a little bit where Stuart comes into this, Stephen's twin brother, and coincidentally, he was actually the first responding officer on the scene of the crime, the morning of the murders. He was the first one there, but he was only there for a few minutes and then he left without telling anyone he was there, without telling anyone of the murders, and without making any notes about it. He didn't preserve the crime scene in any way. He literally just rocked up, took a little squiz, said immediately no. I've seen what I needed to see, and immediately no, and he left. And in doing this, he may have actually hindered the investigation by contaminating the crime scene or destroying forensic evidence. And on top of all of this, the night of the murders, he was actually on a lone patrol. So he was driving by himself in an unmarked red Peugeot, and that red Peugeot was seen by witnesses driving down Kelvin Road the night of the murders. So there is some suspicion, some likelihood that he was involved as well as his brother and his brother's wife. Like they all may have been in on it. Or at least him and his brother. You know, his brother could have come to him and said, my wife is having an affair with this woman and I'm gonna kill her. And Stuart helped him clean it up. Stuart did actually have an alibi for the time of the second fire. Apparently he was like attending a police matter at the time of the second fire, but that doesn't mean he wasn't involved in the first fire, the murder itself, or the cleanup, or destroying evidence. Having an alibi for that second fire, it's not really a full alibi, is it? Once all of this information came out, the community was like up in arms about this, and Allison was copping the most of it. When she was being questioned by police, a mob of 150 people descended on the police station where she was being questioned. They were being extremely hostile towards Allison to the point where police actually had to smuggle her out in the back of a police car. I mean, honestly, you can kind of see where these people's frustrations are coming from, because this investigation has been going on over a year now. These people who they've now arrested were originally suspects, like back when this case first happened a year ago, over a year ago, and it just seemed like the police were going really soft on them, probably because they were police officers and ex-police officers. So people were just really angry, especially because at this point it seems like this case could have been solved a really long time ago and there could have been closure a really long time ago. So people were mad. And if you thought people were mad before, that's nothing compared to 4 days later, because 4 days later, they were all released. Allison, Stuart, and Stephen were all released because the Crown prosecution said that there wasn't enough evidence against them, but Stephen and Stuart were both suspended from duty. It took another 7 months before an announcement was made which officially cleared all of the Lewis's names. And during this announcement, they also asked for new information because by this point, the case has pretty much gone cold again. They were still investigating, they were still looking into the case, but there was really no new evidence, no new information, no new leads. They really just kind of had to go over what they already had in their investigation and see if they could puzzle it together to come up with something new. As they're looking through all of the evidence, obviously the two major pieces of evidence that they have are the bloodied sock and the gold chain, which was caked in blood. And so they decided to make an appeal to see if anybody knew someone who had lost a gold chain around the time of the 26th of June in 1999. This actually kind of, like, there was a massive coincidence in finding out who this may belong to, this gold chain. So there's this off-duty police officer and she goes and plays this game of Skittles, which is kind of like lawn bowls. And while she's there, all of these members from the opposing team are saying to her, like, are you ever going to find out who did this? Are you ever going to find out who's responsible? And she responded and she said, I suppose we will if we ever find out who this gold chain belongs to. And that's when these guys were like, oh, well, that gold chain belongs to David Morris. It's just crazy as well to think about because police had obviously released this information of this chain and this sock and nobody had come forward. Like, people had known about this for a long time now, this chain, and nobody had come forward to say that it belonged to David Morris. And now all of a sudden these guys are like, oh, well, duh, like it belongs to David Morris. But they hadn't come forward when the police were appealing for information about this chain. And it really just goes to show that in these sort of cases, in murder cases, in kidnapping cases, in missing persons investigations, there is always somebody out there who knows something but just isn't coming forward to the police. Always. And it also gets me thinking, like, I wonder if anyone involved in any of the cases I've ever spoken about, like, has watched one of my videos on the case that they're involved in. Because, you know, some people are sick in the head and they, like, kind of get off on watching news about what they've done. They, like, you know, those people that like save newspaper clippings about their crimes and they watch documentaries on their crimes, that sort of thing. So anyway, following this revelation from these guys saying that this chain belonged to David Morris, which is also somebody the police had already looked into. So, you know, them saying this, it's not just like a one-off thing, like, who is this guy? We better look into him. It's like they already kind of were suspicious about him and now all of a sudden the chain is his as well. So police go and conduct a raid on David Morris's home at 7:30 a.m. on the 20th of March 2001, and David Morris was also arrested on suspicion of murder and brought in to be interviewed. He was 38 years old at the time of his arrest, and there was obviously a subsequent search of his house and another relevant property, and they just didn't really have anything on him. They didn't have anything to hold him. So let me tell you a little bit about David Morris. He was a small-time crook that was known to police in Clydach. He had a violent past and had narrowly escaped conviction for an attack on another man with an iron bar. And in total, David had been convicted of almost 24 times for various counts of robbery and violence. As I mentioned earlier in the video, he was divorced. So he had previously been married to a woman named Wendy, who he shared 3 children with. And I will give you a little bit more information on him as we get throughout the rest of the case, but it does seem like he had a pretty rough life up until this point. And something that I also just want to mention, because I find it so crazy, is that he had 3 children of his own and still like murdered these other 2 children. Like, I just find that really bizarre because obviously all forms of murder are incredibly messed up and it's insane that somebody cannot show remorse for any type of murder, but having children of your own and being able to then go and murder children is just inconceivable to me. It's insane. Like, the fact that he's not looking at those children and thinking, oh my goodness, what if this happened to my children? What would my children feel going through this? I don't know. That's just, unreal to me. Now, obviously, the last time they brought him in, he was released because there was no evidence against him, and he also had an alibi. His girlfriend, Mandy Jewell, said that he was with her that night after he had gone drinking and watched the rugby at the pub. But now, the second time he's been arrested and they're questioning him, his story is changing. His story starts off the same. He says he was at the pub drinking, watching the rugby, but at some point he got into an altercation with his girlfriend Mandy Jewell, and so he doesn't end up leaving with her. He decides to stay at the pub, continue drinking, and he also starts talking to this woman named Janice Williams, and then he says that he leaves the pub sometime at around 11:30 p.m. After he leaves, he claims he starts walking towards his parents' house, which is it's a fair whack of a walk. It's a 5-mile walk, and he reckons he just was like, yeah, I'm gonna walk to my parents' house. Halfway through, turns around and says, no, I'm actually gonna go back to my house. And then he gets back to his house at 4:30 a.m. So that's like 5 hours of time that's just unaccounted for, which he reckons he was walking to his parents, decides, no, I'm gonna walk home, and he's just walking for like 5 hours, and that's not suspicious at all. Mandy Jewell, his girlfriend, also says that she couldn't recall what time he returned home that night or the next morning, so he's got no alibi anymore. And then also apparently, like all the way back a day or two after the murders actually took place, the woman that he was talking to at the pub, Janice Williams, actually went into the police station, and she said that she had been at the pub with David the night of the murders, like before the murders took place, and that he was really, really intoxicated. He was taking amphetamines, and apparently he was talking really disrespectfully about Mandy Power as well. Like he was calling her an evil cow and saying that she was a horrible mother, amongst other things. So it was no secret to police that at the time of the murders, David definitely had some hard feelings towards Mandy, to say the least. Unfortunately though, police had no evidence against him. Obviously the reason they had arrested him the second time is because somebody claimed that the gold chain was his, but the gold chain was so heavily caked in blood, and all of the blood was the blood of the victims, so they weren't really able to tie him to this gold chain. And the same story goes for the bloody sock. Again, it was bloodied with all of the blood of the victims. It was kind of used like a glove, so they just weren't able to get any reliable DNA evidence from it. David, of course, also denied that the gold chain was his. He did have a remarkably similar one, but he denied that that one in particular was his, and he said that he had lost his 2 weeks prior to the murders at a construction site. Police actually went back to this construction site and like ripped it all up looking for this gold chain, but I don't believe they ever found it. And you know, all of the lies that he's told police throughout this whole investigation, his story constantly changing, they are not about to start believing him now. Around this time, police also speak to David's cousin, a guy named Eric Williams, and Eric claims to police that David actually came to him asking for money to buy a new gold chain, and David apparently said to him, police are going to come and start asking where my gold chain is, so I need to go and buy another one. Eric also claimed that David told him that he had slept with Mandy the night before the murders occurred at her Kelvin Road home address, and he apparently told Eric that his chain was still with Mandy. So this is obviously huge. This is a huge piece of circumstantial evidence, and with the circumstantial evidence they have, they actually arrest David Morris on 4 counts of murder, and they were set to take him to trial with what they had, even though they had no concrete physical evidence, only circumstantial. So while they're waiting to bring him to trial, they're obviously still trying to gain more evidence against him, and they decide to go and test the gold chain again because, you know, what is one more test gonna hurt? And when they do this test of the gold chain, they actually find little tiny bits of brick dust in the chain, like in the links of the chain. And David is a builder. That's how he apparently lost his gold chain at a construction site, because he was working at the construction site as a builder. There was also allegedly some green paint found, like some really tiny little bits of green paint were found on this chain, and they managed to match this green paint to paint at David's house. But I will say, I thought this was a little weird because they had to strip back 3 layers in order to get to this green paint at his house. I don't know if he had just painted his house 3 times recently, or if he had had this chain since the dawn of time. I don't know, just a little weird, but it did match. And then after all of this pushback, after David denying that the chain belonged to him, he finally caved and admitted that it was in fact his chain. And he also admitted that he did in fact have sex with Mandy on the Friday night, so the night before the murders occurred. Obviously, there's two possible reasons that he could be lying about this. One, he has a girlfriend, Mandy Jules, so he could be lying because he doesn't want her to find out that he was cheating on her, or obviously the other big reason could be because he is a murderer. The police's theory is that obviously the night of the murders, he was out drinking, he was taking drugs, so he was pretty wasted, and he decided to walk to Mandy's house. He made a sexual advance towards her and she declined him, and so he beat her to death with the fiberglass rod. And then obviously the children and the mother were home, and so he decided to murder all of them as well so that there were no witnesses. So his trial began almost a year or just over a year after he was arrested. So it started on the 10th of April in 2002, and it was being held at the Swansea Crown Court, and this trial was massive. The media were obsessed and it was being reported across the whole of the UK. The prosecution was being led by a man named Patrick Harrington, and he was a very well-respected barrister, but he still had to convince everybody that David did this because, again, there is still no physical evidence against David, only circumstantial. The prosecution during the trial told the jury that David was violent, he was a violent person, and they presented and backed this up with evidence of his previous crimes. A friend of Mandy's named Gary Bainon also took the stand, and he said that Mandy and David had never slept together, they didn't have any kind of relationship, but that Mandy was scared of David. I think they kind of knew each other from hanging around in the same sort of circles, but they didn't have a one-on-one relationship. Most of the prosecution's case was based around David's inaccuracies, the fact that he kept changing up his story, and also the fact that he now admitted that the gold chain was his. And obviously this gold chain was found in the house, caked in blood. So the jury heard all of this evidence. They also heard that, the prosecution believed that he had gone and made a sexual advance towards Mandy Power. She had rejected him, and that is why he murdered her and her entire family. They described his alleged actions as an orgy of savagery, and they actually showed the jury a very graphic photo from the crime scene, which was so bad that one of the jury members actually collapsed and had to be taken to hospital. Prosecutors also believed that Mandy's mother, Doris, was also the first victim because the fiberglass rod didn't have any of her blood, so I don't know if it was just so caked under the other 3 layers of blood from the other 3 victims, or if he kind of murdered her, cleaned off the fiberglass rod, and then the other murders took place. But their theory is basically that he walked to Mandy's house and he got there while Mandy was still out babysitting for her cousin. So it was just Doris in the house by herself, and he went up and he murdered her and then waited for Mandy to get home with her 2 children later that night, and that is when the other 3 murders took place. Now, the defense basically tried to take blame off David by putting everything onto Alison Lewis and painting her as a prime suspect. And their reasoning for this is that, as I mentioned earlier, they recovered a vibrator from inside Mandy and they swabbed this. They also swabbed Mandy's inner thigh, and this DNA came back and said there were mixed materials that belonged to Mandy and potentially also Alison Lewis. I mean, this is really their only evidence to kind of tie Alison into it. They didn't present any evidence that she was actually at the house. There's no other evidence that they presented to paint Alison as the suspect besides this DNA found on the vibrator, which could be something that they used during intercourse because, as we know, they were having an affair. Alison was brought in to take the stand during the trial and she maintained her innocence, but the defense wasn't done yet. Alison was in the witness box for about 4 days during this trial. And during this time, they basically did everything that they could to disparage Alison. For example, Alison was a martial arts expert. She was a black belt in karate. She had also competed at a high level in karate. And so the defense got a karate expert or karate instructor to come in and show how Allison could have used the fiberglass rod to commit the murders. Another thing that the defense brought up to use against Allison is actually a movie. So there was a movie that Allison and Mandy liked to watch together called Armageddon, and Mandy had lent this to her neighbor, her friend Louise Pugh. And apparently leading up to the murders, she asked Louise if she could have it back so that she could watch it with Allison in case Allison ended up coming over. And Louise said that she did return the movie before the murders took place. And sure enough, at the crime scene, there were all of these movies like strewn around on the ground, and it kind of looked like the killer had set them up. But the weird thing is there was one movie missing. The box was there, but the actual tape was missing, and that was, of course, Armageddon. And then when they went to check Allison's house, what movie do you think they found? I'll give you a second. Armageddon. So there's all these little things that aren't physical evidence, they're circumstantial evidence, but they definitely paint Allison in a suspicious light. And that's kind of what they have on David as well. Both of these people, there's no actual physical evidence against either of them. There's only circumstantial evidence. And that's really why the defense is trying to show all of this circumstantial evidence against Allison, because really it could have been either of them at this stage. At the end of the trial, the jury deliberated for 3 days, and they delivered their verdict on the 28th of June in 2002, in which they found David Morris guilty on 4 counts of murder, and he was sentenced to 4 life sentences. But 2.5 years later, this sentencing was actually overturned because there was a conflict of interest. Like, he had an unfair trial due to a conflict of interest with his legal team. And turns out this is because his solicitor actually worked for the Lewis brothers, none other than the Lewis brothers, when they were suspects. So because his sentencing was overturned, he had to go through a retrial, and this retrial lasted 3.5 months, and at the end of it, he was actually reconvicted and his original sentencing was upheld. But believe it or not, this is actually where it gets a little bit juicy. Now, I live in the UK at the moment, so I don't want to go to prison for anything I'm about to say, so I'm going to preface this all by saying this is all alleged, of course, and everything that I'm saying is all information that is readily available on the internet. Basically, since David was convicted, some more evidence and information has come out which alludes to the fact that he was wrongfully convicted, wrongfully imprisoned, and that there may have been a potential botched police investigation to cover up for some not guilty police officers. Since David was in prison, there have been a multitude of supporters who have come out to say that they don't believe that he was responsible in this case, that he was wrongfully convicted, and his family have always maintained that he is not responsible for these murders. There have been campaigns for his release, and when you look at it, it's not just his family and his friends who are doing all of this and holding these campaigns and trying to prove his innocence. It's some very intelligent people who have done the research. They have looked into all aspects of this case and the investigation, and that they believe there has been a miscarriage of justice. One of these people is a man called Dr. Brian Thornton from the Winchester Justice Project. And he basically discovered or uncovered that there were essentially 2 different investigations into the murder of Mandy and her family. And one of these investigations was centered around David Morris, and the other investigation was centered around the Lewises. He heavily scrutinizes the investigation done into the Lewises. Apparently, Stuart Lewis couldn't even say what he was doing at the time of the murders. He couldn't recall. He also claims that there were repeated lies told by the Lewises throughout the entire investigation. There's also the matter of Louise Pugh, who allegedly also saw Stephen Lewis at Mandy's house threatening to kill her for the affair. And then Allison is claiming that he didn't know a thing about the affair. On top of this, there was actually another statement recorded within hours of the murders taking place where an unidentified informant said that they had overheard Mandy saying that she and her kids had been threatened by her lover's husband, who was also a police officer. Some other weird things that came up is that Stephen Lewis initially claimed that he had never been into Mandy's house, never. But as the story kind of evolved, allegedly, he admitted that he had gone inside maybe once or twice. And then this evolved into him apparently like lighting some matches to get her stovetop lit so he could make her a cup of tea when Mandy has an electric stovetop, so she doesn't even have a gas stovetop, so there would be no need for matches anyway. But then he also allegedly claimed that he may or may not have touched the murder weapon, the fiberglass rod, by accident. You know, as you do, just going around people's house, touching fiberglass rods. I've been there, totally. You know, I'm always going to people's houses and just picking up their fiberglass rods and then telling people that I've never been to that person's house before. Apparently there was also DNA, male DNA, found on the bloodied sock from the scene of the crime, but at the time that they found this DNA was not seen as useful because they couldn't determine who the DNA actually belonged to. Some people think with the advancements in DNA today that they might be able to retest that and kind of get a better picture of who that DNA belongs to, maybe test it alongside David's DNA or against Stephen's DNA, but unfortunately this DNA cannot be retested because it's not considered new evidence because it's part of the original case. I don't know why that matters, but basically the only way that they would be able to retest that is if they present it alongside new evidence. I mean, maybe they just don't want to do that because they're worried that it actually would be Stephen's DNA rather than David's DNA on the bloody sock, but more recently, there's actually been a totally new witness that has come forward, after everything has been said and done. David's in prison, the whole thing's almost case closed. This guy named John Allen comes forward and he basically said that on the morning of the murders at 4:30 a.m. he saw Stephen Lewis walking with a green bag under his arm and he just kind of walked off into the darkness. And he says that he never came forward with this information before because he didn't think that anyone would believe him because, you know, Stephen's a police officer. And what's crazy about this as well is if you remember the original e-fit that wasn't released to the public, that woman drove by and she saw a man with a bag under his arm and then she gave the e-fit and it looked like Stephen Lewis. You know, it kind of all adds up. So 5 months after John Allen came forward, the South Wales police said that they were going to be reviewing the case with an independent oversight. Before anything could come out about this, you know, reinvestigation, or not reinvestigation, but them kind of looking into it again, in August of 2021, David Morris actually passed away in prison and his family still maintains his innocence in this case to this day. In October of that same year, the results from the review on the case were released on social media, and they basically said that they were able to loosely link David's DNA to the DNA that was obtained from the bloody sock. It wasn't a 100% match, but I think they attributed this to being 20-year-old DNA. So it wasn't anything concrete, but I think it was just enough for them to kind of reaffirm that they did the right thing and they got the right guy and that sort of thing. But what is weird is that the South Wales police have refused to hand over the forensic evidence to David's legal team. They will not give them the full forensic report. And they also won't say why they won't release this report to them. But that's really it for this case, honestly. That's kind of where we're at. David's family is still fighting to clear his name and prove that he was innocent of this crime. And it seems like we will never truly know what happened on that night. And we'll never truly know what happened to Doris, Mandy, Katie, and Emily. I would love to hear your thoughts on this case because although it is a solved case, I still think there are so many questions surrounding this case. Did David actually do it? There was no concrete evidence that he was actually responsible for this crime. And there is circumstantial evidence that suggests that he did do it, but there's also a lot of circumstantial evidence to suggest that the Lewises were involved. I don't think it's a secret to anybody that police protect police, and that could be a major factor in this case. case. I mean, I truly don't think that this case is solved. I think that there is more information that we don't know, and I just think there's more to it. But I would love to hear your thoughts. I would love to hear what you guys think. If you think that this case is case closed, or if you think there's more to it, what you think happened, I would love to discuss with you in the comments. But that's everything for this case. That's all from me today, guys. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and hopefully I will see you in my next video. Bye, guys.